Well, we're hearing so much these days about contamination and the quality of the water we drink. 13 Investigates reveals how the state allows companies that are caught contaminating your neighborhood to avoid cleaning up their dangerous messes. Investigative reporter Sandra Chapman explains how they can go unpunished for years while it spreads.
They are abandoned factories.
We never suspected ground chemicals and asbestos.
Old work sites.
The contamination was in people's drinking water.
Even active businesses.
I mean, it's my water that I drink, cook with, bathe with.
All have one messy problem: dangerous contaminants leaking from their sites.
And want to see this whole mess cleaned up?
The companies promise to do that.
Because there's children in this neighborhood?
Despite decades of warnings, 13 Investigates discovered the state of Indiana failing to enforce its own environmental rules, allowing violators to hide in its VRP, Voluntary Remediation Program. Companies get 180 days to file a cleanup plan, but some fail to submit them for over a decade, sometimes not even at all. As long as the companies are enrolled, no one can sue them, but nothing happens to businesses that fail to clean up their mess either.
We're talking about basically 30 times the drinking water standard.
Adam Rickert leads the Marion County Health Department's hazardous materials team. He discovered dangerous levels of vinyl chloride in 3 wells in this southwest side neighborhood.
Did it alarm you to find that?
Absolutely.
A neighborhood so contaminated, it's now recommended for the list of the worst hazardous waste sites in the country.
You've never found vinyl chloride in any other water system here in Marion County before?
That's correct.
The toxins forced the shutdown of all the water wells on Castle and West Vermont streets.
It causes brain, lung, liver cancer, and cancers of the blood.
The EPA came in to investigate and has now warned Marisol Lopez and her neighbors chemical vapors could seep into their homes next.
I was like, this is kind of scary.
And we discovered this health scare could have and should have been prevented. For 10 years, IDEM, the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, has known about dangerous chemicals leaking into the soil and groundwater from a nearby industrial warehouse and a former dry cleaner. Special air filters were installed at a daycare in the same strip mall where the dry cleaner once operated. Early testing revealed the pool of toxins spreading towards Marisol's neighborhood across the street.
It's not right. It really just isn't, especially knowing that you're putting a hazard towards other people.
What's disturbing is both companies were part of the state's VRP. Genuine Parts still is. But Aimco, the company that owned the site of the dry cleaner, not only refused to do the required testing and sampling, but made the problem worse by injecting unapproved chemicals into the ground. Finally, last June, nearly a decade after Aimco joined the program, it was terminated for failing to take appropriate action. Aimco is now discussing new cleanup plans in environmental court.
The state needs to follow through on that, though.
13 Investigates found dozens of sites like this languishing sometimes for years. Since 2000, 353 companies have participated in the VRP. 62 of them, or 1 in 6 companies, were terminated or threatened with termination for failing to clean up as promised. In many of those cases, it took IDEM nearly a decade to take action.
That's a fundamental flaw in the program.
Dick Van Frank, a local environmentalist, isn't surprised.
It's a way to avoid taking the responsibility.
The former owners and operators of those facilities are responsible for those cleanups.
13 Investigates visited sites all across the state, like this one in Seymour.
And they run a tube down there.
Billy Atwood isn't sure what leaked into the ground at Seymour Housewares, now called Home Products International. His front porch is just 200 feet from the factory that makes ironing boards and coverings. Buried in his yard, 3 monitoring wells put in by the company. Yet no one told him what they're looking for.
And my concern was, why do you want to drill? I think it's about 8 feet down. Samples of contamination, I guess.
The company promised IDEM it would monitor groundwater contamination, report the results, and clean up the site. But after 17 years in the state's VRP, IDEM threatened to kick the company out for a lack of progress. So what does IDEM have to say about all of these lapses?
Keeping the site moving and getting the site cleaned up.
13 Investigates asked agency directors to sit down to talk for our story. When our request went unanswered, we tracked down the agency's assistant commissioner at a public meeting.
How does that happen, that a company can be in your program for decades and nobody forced them to go ahead and either clean up or take some sort of enforcement action?
I really don't want to comment on anything till I've had an opportunity to talk to our media folks.
Bruce Palin oversees the agency's land quality division, the division that handles the VRP.
What's your media person
Because I've been in
tell
years,
you?
I know not to do an interview like this without having a discussion with folks.
Questions about the state's VRP aren't altogether new for IDEM. Lawmakers proposed changes to prevent cleanup delays back in January. The measure stalled in the Senate. At the time, IDEM had its hands full with a mess in Goshen.
We're this close to the factory. I mean, it's right over here.
This old Johnson Controls site in Jeff Chupp's neighborhood has been part of IDEM's voluntary remediation program for 20 years. Chemicals seeped into the groundwater and flowed off-site there, too.
We have always known since early 1990s that there were some environmental concerns below the surface.
Johnson Controls cleaned up the contaminated water on his property and connected nearby homes to city water before selling the site to Tocon Holdings. But neighbors say the plan didn't go far enough. 2 class action lawsuits claim chemical vapors have intruded their homes, and high levels of groundwater contamination flow all the way to the high school. And just months ago, more bad news. A botched plan to tear down the old buildings created yet another threat: asbestos.
IDEM inspectors actually visited this site last December before giving the go-ahead for the demolition. There's just one problem. Not one single sample was taken. And when it all came crumbling down, they realized that was a huge mistake. This entire neighborhood is now susceptible to cancer-causing asbestos contamination.
A new environmental report shows asbestos in 47 samples taken from the piles.
I'm surprised they didn't inspect better. They just could have done a lot more. I mean, they really could have done a lot more to help protect the people in this neighborhood.
The EPA has since taken over. IDEM's response to all of this?
I really don't appreciate being hijacked in a meeting like this.
Well, you're a public official. This is a public meeting. Are you guys hiding from this issue?
I'm not going to respond to any of your questions at this time.
It seems no one at IDEM wants to talk about any of it.
One of the companies, Aimco, disputes IDEM's account of what happened. That statement is at WTHR.com. Now, in an email, IDEM says it is evaluating if and when to add more oversight to this remediation program. The agency also just added a new review panel to handle cleanup disputes, but still no set times to answer our questions. Naomi?